Okie croaks, can you all hear me? Take that as a yes.
Yes, we can, sorry.
Okay. Let's just make sure I've got mine. So the first thing, actually, what I'd like you all to do is pop in the chat what your favourite veg and what your growing space is like, just so I can get a bit of an idea of, yeah, what you're working with and what you'd like to grow. Are we expecting anyone else there? Or is this more or less the numbers?
No, we are expecting more. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see if
I'll just keep admitting people.
Where can I find? Oh, there's the chat. Great. Broccoli. Oh, that's always such a challenge, that one. Everything loves broccoli. The slugs, the butterflies. Tomatoes, nice. Lovely. Okay, so I'm hoping at the end of this session to have time to kind of go back to these and sort of check in to make sure that we've covered all the tips around growing these favourite veggies and in the appropriate spaces. So, wildlife friendly food growing. My name's Rosa, the land management officer at Grow Wilder. That sort of encompasses looking after the food growing and looking after the habitat management across the site, and yeah, doing that in the most kind of wildlife friendly way as possible. Little intro to Grow Wilder for those that haven't yet been here. We're quite a dynamic site. We've got lots of different projects that kind of work and operate from this 6 acres, and our land partner model means that it makes this very kind of exciting culture, and yeah, there's always lots of people coming and going, and it's really the kind of community engagement face of Avon Wildlife Trust. In a way, we always have lots and lots of groups and people coming to site. For example, today we had a corporate volunteering day. We had the Wednesday drop-in volunteers, and we had a number of kind of site hire groups as well, and a horticulture course that's run by Bristol City Council. So there's always lots of different events that are run here, so keep an eye out for what's going on. So the contents for today, I'm going to start with soil health. I'm conscious that you had Alex last week, and he probably covered a lot of what I will touch on there, so I'll kind of breeze through that, but I think it's a really fundamental place to start, right, when we're talking about wildlife and food growing and how we do that. Beneficial insects and non-beneficial ones and how to identify them. And then composting in different scales, whether that's a kind of balcony scale or community garden. Preparing your growing space for this coming year and where to start. We'll also touch on that. And then thinking about next steps in resourcing and signposting for sharing, I guess, is the main thing. I really want to encourage you to draw on already this group, this community that you're making in this online course. You can really help a lot with getting people going and supporting that. So what is soil? I think this is one of the biggest questions that a lot of growing and horticultural courses are always trying to grapple with. There's a few nice diagrams here, just to try and sum it up, I suppose. Yeah, so we have the different sized kind of minerals within our soil. We've got the sand, which is the biggest one, right? You'll see on that diagram on the right. We've got the silt, which is the next one down, and clay, which is the smallest sized particle. And that's often when you've got, you know, very clay heavy soils, are much harder to work because the drainage is they can saturate much easier. And always something that I'm like amazed by is that you have to remember a lot of our food is grown within the top sort of 6 inches of topsoil, in that sort of organic layer and topsoil stratosphere. And yeah, just astonishing that I remember hearing we've got something like, you know, 100 harvests left in our topsoil in terms of the nutrition and the health of it and the food it can provide for us until our soils are kind of exhausted. So it's really important from when you're starting to think about growing and think about producing food for yourself and your community, that you start with the health of the soil as your priority. And yeah, and then also to think of the soil that there's also lots of air and water in there, right? I think we often forget that. We think that there's the minerals and the organic matter and all the biology and all the ecology and the soil life, but we also need to make sure we leave room for the water and the air. And to avoid compacting soil is often one of the big things that I'm constantly reminding people here when we're growing food in the market garden, to not step on the beds and to make sure that we look after that soil structure so it continues to be healthy. I hope you can all see this. There's some small text in there, but just to give that idea that everything is connected, right? And to grow healthy plants, we need to think about the soil food web and making sure that yeah, we feed the soil before we feed the plant. Fire away with any questions as I'm going. This is a slightly complicated diagram, but I don't know, you may have seen this last week actually with Alex's presentation. But I think it really sums up that the blurring of those boundaries, right? The kind of soil life, the plant life, the aquatic and terrestrial life, and how this section, this sort of zoom in section here to the root zone, that healthy soil needs roots in it. Basically, there is that constant exchange between the plant life giving the fungal life, the mycelium, which is all of that like white fibrous-y stuff that you may find when you're digging away in your gardens, and they're constantly exchanging sugars and minerals, and a soil becomes lifeless when you remove the roots. And I think it's really something to remember when we're like weeding and constantly digging our allotments over, is that actually you're disturbing the soil life more than you realize. Yeah, we'll share all these slides afterwards, so if you wanted to check back on these diagrams. And again, just another iteration really how important roots are. This picture on the left is a really nice photo of living pathways. So here in between there will have had a kind of mustard or clovery grass mix to make sure even under our even under our feet and in the pathways that we're looking after the soil and making sure that there is living kind of material and roots in there. And then this one on the right is just it's a slightly blurry, but yeah, a great diagram of the importance of that mycelial fungal network and the way that the plant roots and the mycelial network work together to kind of increase their surface area to such an extent they can tap into minerals and nutrients and water. So keeping your soil as undisturbed as possible means that this mycelial network can develop. I think one of the questions I get here when I talk about how we do kind of minimum dig approaches in the food growing areas is that, you know, it's kind of to grow food, you have to disturb the soil. It's an undeniable element of it. To cultivate, you are disturbing the soil, but with that in mind, it's prioritizing prioritizing the soil life, you know, first and foremost, I guess, because we're constantly kind of pulling, the ecosystem is driving itself towards a woodland, and we're constantly drawing it back, getting rid of the bramble, getting rid of the quick ground cover weeds to make sure we've got space to grow food. So it's getting yourself used to that, to the reason why you're weeding and why you're constantly having to clear ground. Yeah, to make yourself feel good about it, I suppose. So yeah, when it comes to growing food, and I think this picture shows quite nicely on the left how they've very densely planted. So one of the key things about sort of agroecological food growing, so is to try and have your soil covered as much as possible. And one of the ways in doing that is to plant very densely and to companion plant. And a couple of other terms that you may hear or you may have heard is interplanting or intercropping, and also polyculture. So they all kind of nod towards the same thing, but it's essentially diversifying your cropping to make sure that everything is kind of complementing each other. Particularly planting herbs, you know, they come with, they're medicinal for us, but they're also medicinal for plants. And to make sure, so I often plant, one of the main companion planting sort of techniques I use is using allium. So the onion family is obviously incredibly strong smelling, strong flavored, and I plant them at the edges of a lot of the brassica beds or at the edges of salad beds, because they're the two families, the brassica family, which is like the broccolis and the kales. They are loved by everything, as I said at the beginning. The pigeons, the butterflies, the aphids love all the broccolis and cabbages. So trying to use natural ways to defend your brassica crop is really, really helpful. And this whole companion planting philosophy really works with that. So knowing your insects. I mean, I could make dozens and dozens of slides about this, but I think these are the top ones. Does anyone know, if anyone wants to unmute and shout out if they know any of these? Otherwise, I'll rattle on. So we've got this top left is a hoverfly. Looks incredibly similar, so a wasp, right, or a bee, that stripy abdomen. But you will identify them in the way that they fly. Okay, so they hover incredibly stationary, and then they kind of dart. And often wasps and bees fly in very different ways. So it's learning to identify these particular insects, and if you've got them about, they're really amazing pollinators.
Do they eat any other predators?
Hoverflies, I think. In fact, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Let me see. Oh, there you go. They eat aphids. The amazing thing about aphids, even though we all, as food growers and as gardeners, really give aphids a lot of bad press, they are essentially building blocks for a lot of the insect life, and a lot of these photos here, a lot of these insects live off aphids. So it's something that I'm working to kind of change my philosophy, particularly around aphids, is how do I overwinter my aphids in order to provide winter food for these insects, because these are the ones that I want to be able to have healthy populations quite early on in the year. So yeah, anyway, I'll just talk through these photos and then I'll go to the next one. So we've got the next one, this one here, I think you can see my mouse, is a parasitic wasp, braconid wasp, Apparently we have over 6,000 species of parasitic wasp in the UK. And they're really amazing as a, you know, very, very proactive predators for yeah, lots of things. Then we've got a red admiral butterfly, also a beautiful pollinator. This little guy down here is a soldier beetle. Then we've got a lacewing, also amazing aphid hunter, and a ladybird, same, love the kind of black flying ladybirds. So I'll just let you absorb that for a moment. But yeah, effectively, a lot of these insects enjoy the things that we want less of. So we want less slugs, we want less aphids, and we want to get that balance. And so planting, you know, I was talking about companion planting. If you can plant herbs, or calendula is like a marigold. It's not the same, but it looks similar. Fennel, flowers that are really kind of open and allow insects easy access into that pollen. You'll get lots and lots of beneficial insects. I think one of the things we often forget as well is spiders and centipedes, the ones that are kind of like live under in the dark nooks and crannies, are often yeah, the best kind of recyclers, like things like the wood lice. And really important to encourage a whole diversity of things. Any questions about those? So with that in mind, creating habitats for these particular insects and species, these are generally the ones I always recommend. We have a super healthy ecosystem in our market garden in Grow Wilder, and I'm really adamant that it's because of our pond network. We've got 4 ponds on site, and we've got a really big, quite established pond right next to the market garden. And every year there are hundreds and hundreds of frogs, lots and lots of newts, a huge amount of dragonflies and damselflies, and they all act in a very proactive way to keep our slug population in our market garden to quite a low level. You may have heard recently that the RHS have changed the definition of the slug and the snail to not a pest, but to a really important kind of ecosystem, insect in your ecosystem. So yeah, it's trying to change our approach, I guess, to our slug battle, not as a battle, as something that we can try and get into that balance. And certainly introducing ponds and any kind of water really will really work towards that. In certain times of the year at Grow Wilder, when the frogs like to hatch, we can walk through the grassy areas around that pond, and the tiny little frogs will like scatter at our feet. We've got that many, and I'm really certain that it's because of all that life that keeps that protects our food growing, basically. And then just a nod to, it's all very well creating habitats, but to connect them is even more essential. And perhaps working within your neighbourhood, your street, in fact, on my road in Fish Ponds, we've just got a little bit of money to create a beeline within our front garden. So people are sharing now kind of pots and seeds and plugs to make sure that, yeah, connecting that habitat is kind of promoted throughout. So this top left slug here is it's called a tiger slug, and these slugs eat other slugs. So they will also probably eat your salad, but they are predatory to other slugs. So if you see this little one about, they're in your favor. And yeah, just the fact that they are also really important food for lots of other life and bird life. One of the most effective ways, I think, to control slugs, if you're really struggling with them, is to go out at dusk and physically pick them off your plants. That is the time of the day that they will feed. They tend to avoid kind of midday sun. So yeah, you won't see them as much out in the day, but towards the evening, when it gets all a bit dewy, they'll be out, and yeah, pick them off and chuck them over your fence or or whatever. Make a kind of slug potion with them. So composting. Oh yeah, I was going to mention at the start, we're going to stop at 7:15 for a break for 5 minutes. Just so you've got that in mind, we're having a break in a moment. Okay, so composting, I guess in the same continuation of the sort of soil conversation, the way in which you can enrich the soil, one of the ways is by using compost and compost teas, which is something I'll talk to in a second. But I kind of like these definitions of composting and compost, because we're always looking for definitions, right, to try and lock it in our mind of what are the edges of things, what makes compost, and humus, and soil. But yeah, I think it's that process of intentionally bringing kind of organic materials through that decomposition process into a very stable growing material that you can either use as mulch, which is just the process of laying on the top of ground, or you can dig it into the ground, or you can plant straight into it, depending on the quality of your compost.
Rosa, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, please do.
Slide, that looks to me that the compost is sort of made in a hole in the ground. It's like a compost bin in a hole in the ground. Is that correct?
This, I think, is a pile just on top of the ground by the looks of it. There's some cars here in the background, so I think looks like it's mounded up, and they've just allowed it to probably this is kind of what we have to do with our municipal compost at Grow Wilder. So we get a huge amount of compost from the council, which is used from food waste from across the city and garden waste and so on, and it gets kind of produced in I imagine kind of huge long kind of vats, and it gets turned and then delivered to site. And one of the ways that we basically have to wait for about a year until the compost has properly broken down and there's life that's gotten into there. So yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer. I hope that answers your question.
The compost that we've when I do it in our allotment, it breaks down over the year. You find all of the harder twigs goes to the top, because obviously everything settles down over the year, and then you get all of the big twigs that haven't really broken down, but all the goodness have come out of it into the soil. But you get, so it looks like where you've left it, you've just got all the stuff that has been harder to compost, really.
So do you order the municipal compost?
We just chuck all of our peelings and things like that, and then leave it for a year, and our raspberry canes and stuff like that, but they won't break down, but they create a bit of a patch over the top to keep it warmer, to help.
So that works for you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, one of the ways in which we deal with our really thick woody cuttings at Grow Wilder is making a massive dead hedge along our Frenchley Park Road boundary. So the bits, like you say, Carolyn, that you can't that's not going to be easily composted, we tend to separate then and take to create a habitat. But yeah, I would be wary of the municipal composters. I think it's a really amazing way to know that our food waste is going into something good, and community gardens can get growing material relatively cheap, but it needs there's a lot of time that needs to pass until it's it kind of, for us, when it arrived, it was almost aquaphobic. When we planted into it and watered, the water just kind of ran away from it. It was very bizarre. So it was so dry that there was no life in it. And yeah, compost should really, in theory, be the complete opposite of that, right? It should be bringing a lot of nutrition, a lot of life into the soil. So composting is such an amazing process and experience, and I think it always blows my mind that we generate a lot of food waste here on site, and it goes from this huge volume of material down into the tiniest little bit of compost. Yes, any other questions about that? The different cuts, there's a couple of little examples of types of composting. Cold composting, which is what most of us would have, like in our gardens, where you're literally just piling loads of your brown and your green elements together and just leaving it. You're not turning it, you're not generating that that kind of aerobic hot composting. Leaf mold is a really amazing one. It's very easy, especially if you live near a woodland or if you've got some trees in your garden. Collect up all that leaf fall, and it really produces a lot of that organic matter. And then a wormery, I think, is an amazing place to start if you've got a really small amount of space. Or there's someone who came on the Grow Leader course recently, and she just had a balcony, and she grew lots of like beans and sweet peas and things, and she started a wormery and is totally raving about it. Here our wormeries are in the form of a bin, of an old just a standard bin that's kind of submerged into the ground, and then holes are drilled into that half submerged bit, and we put all of our cooked food waste into the wormery, and the worms then just come naturally through the holes and start to digest it. So because you can't put cooked food waste in your composting, so our compost bins, things like, you know, bones and cooked fish and all that sort of stuff, you don't want to put in your compost bins because it will attract rats and it doesn't break down in a particularly healthy way. So a wormery is a really amazing way to deal with cooked food waste. So getting that nitrogen carbon balance when you're making compost is really, really critical. If you have too much nitrogen, then your compost becomes quite putrid. It just doesn't break down. So you need those kind of twigs and sawdust. We use a lot of wood chip here because we get it delivered from local tree surgeons for free. So every time I empty the bin of uncooked food waste from the kitchen, I then put a wheelbarrow of wood chip on top, and it just makes that layer, and we create some really nice compost. And yeah, I guess important to note that the compost needs to get to a certain temperature for those particular weed seeds and kind of bacteria to be targeted. So I know people that have kind of thermometers in their compost bins, but only if you get really, really nerdy into compost is that necessary. But just to know that you can put your hands on there and you can feel some warmth is really good. If things are getting much cooler, then turning it into another bucket or into the next bay is important to do. And yeah, just thought I would recommend this because a lot of people ask what kind of compost we sow our seeds into, and we use this one on the left is is the sort of commercial Melcourt silver mix, but on the right you can get this one in garden centres, and it's more like domestic size bags, and it's just got a really, really nice texture to it. I think often people struggle with propagation because of the quality of their seed compost, basically. So making sure your seed compost isn't too woody with like lots of big pieces in it. Seeds are you know, they're tough, but they do like a kind of quite a fine, tilthy seed compost. So I guess this slide, I forgot to add more seasonal moments, but anyway, there's two that always stick in my mind, particularly at the start of the year when I'm thinking about when do you start, right? Like that whole question of when is it okay to sow seeds and when is it okay to plant things out? These are the two moments for me that are really critical. When the snowdrops come up in sort of January, maybe early Feb, I know that the ground is starting to warm, it's starting to thaw, and that's the moment to start sowing your seeds into modules on your windowsill or in your allotment if you've got covered space. And always keep an eye out for your local forecasted last frost. You can often find that on the Met Office, and it will tell you. I know here our last frost was something like, in fact I think it's yet to come, it's like mid, yeah, it can often be later than you think, basically. And then yeah, when the hawthorn blossom comes out, like right now I'm sat in front of a bright white hawthorn, and that is the moment then when the ground is where most things are warm enough so you can sow seeds direct, plant your plugs out.
May I ask you another question, please, Rosa?
Yes, please
On
do.
on the thing about the ground warming up, I mean, I remember earlier on this year, and we had that very late, very cold weather, and I've always had trouble with this, feeling nervous about sowing anything because it feels so intensely cold. But then what feels intensely cold to me may not be compared to what it was, you know. I don't know what constitutes warm enough to start sowing.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a really cold spring, I guess it's important to say. This year has been exceptionally cold. A lot of the plants are much further behind than I would expect them to be at this point. But I think, you know, what I like to encourage in people is a sense of curiousness and fearlessness, you know, like to just try it and see what works, and year on year you will start to build a sense of knowing that, okay, this, you know, you just start to pick up the cues, I guess, that the seasons are telling you, and that there's no regimented right or wrong with any of these things, because it totally depends on what you're growing and where you are in the world. You know, things like aubergine and peppers, right, and even tomatoes, although they're tropical plants and need, generally speaking, they need polytunnel environments. You need, in the climate we have, we need to sow them in early Jan, mid-Jan, which seems completely like counterintuitive because it's so cold, right? But because they need such a long growing season, because we haven't got that temperature throughout the year, you need to start them off much earlier than you would expect, so that there's enough time in the year for them to fruit and get to fruit. So growing things like chilies, tomatoes, aubergines, I would encourage people to start them off inside in like late Jan. And then all your other bits, like your salads and your brassicas and your alliums and things, they're like, I guess, easier in a way because yeah, easier than your polytunnel crops, because they're much more expensive, and it feels much more gutting, I think, to lose chilies and tomatoes and aubergines that you've been nurturing since kind of early in the year, and then they don't work. Whereas you can just always sow more of the other things, because they're much faster. They come up much faster.
Have you noticed a difference in the climate change and everything through sort of like that season? So sort of like, I know this year's been exceptionally cooler, but yeah, would you say that has changed, like the growing season in the time for planting and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it hasn't changed it to such an extent where I'm not yet sowing my chilies in, November the year before, for example, or it's not completely changed it. But last year we had, our summer was so hot, and then a really, really cold few weeks in winter has meant that a lot of plants actually at Grow Wilder haven't survived. Things that have been here for years and years and years. A plant particularly that I'm thinking, and it's called New Zealand flax. I can never remember its Maori name, but it's essentially a huge grass-like ornamental shrub that the Maori population will have used for weaving. So it's a really, really strong fibrous grass plant, and super impressive. And I'm pretty sure that's been killed off in the last year because of our really dry summer and then super cold winter. So there are definitely things that you would expect to survive through an Australian climate, but our fluctuating seasons now are kind of becoming more unpredictable. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, no worries. Something to, I don't know, I put here successional planting, just want to clarify what that means. That purely means that you're planting or you're sowing or you're planting things at regular occurrences. So say if you're growing beetroot from like March to September, you're not going to have that one beetroot plant survive the whole summer. So we sow a tray of beetroot every 2 weeks, because we want that constant crop of beetroot throughout the summer. So things that you're going to want lots of, your beetroots, your salads, your spring onions, maybe your kale, you have to make sure that you're sowing every 2 to 3 weeks, so that you can, once that plant is kind of exhausted or you've harvested it, that you've got then another flush of plants to plant out. So one of the things we spend a lot of time doing at Grow Wilder is kind of reclaiming space from the wild and trying to get on top of our perennial weeds. So we've got a huge amount of couch grass, horsetail, bindweed and bramble. They're like the power four. And yeah, I guess we talk a lot about no dig or low dig, and more often than not, it's very, very hard to do that unless you've gotten rid of your perennial weeds. So particularly the couch grass and the bindweed, they really can strangle a food crop that you're growing. You want to make sure that you've gotten those roots out of the ground before you can then plant your food plants in. So yeah, in order to no dig, or in order to have a philosophy around minimum dig, you have to dig, which is a slight irony, but you do have to prepare a bed for it. And so this picture on the right they've put a kind of mulch of cardboard and straw, and there's lots of benefits to that. It's keeping the weed seeds off your bed, it's keeping water in, and it's keeping the bed warm enough. So like particularly you could start mulching like this in kind of January, February, and your bed will be warmer quicker than if this layer of cardboard and straw wasn't there. So you'd be able to plant out sooner. What else? Oh yeah, perennial weeds are at their weakest when they're flowering. That's really important to know, that when your bindweeds have got the big white trumpet flowers, that's the moment to start pulling them down, because yeah, they'll be really vulnerable then, and the root system is at its weakest. Any questions about that? What have people done around reclaiming space? How have you dealt with your overgrown allotments or gardens?
Hi Rosa, can I ask you a question? I'm Jenny. I've got 2 raised beds, and I just wondered whether you would recommend putting cardboard in those before you start planting each year.
Yeah, I would. As long as you can find cardboard that hasn't got too much ink on it,
Yeah.
and remove the sellotape from it, then cardboard is a really brilliant mulching material that doesn't last very long, but it not only provides that mulch and that weed protection, but it also breaks down and adds nutrients then back into the soil.
Okay. It's too late to put it in now?
No, not at all. No. In fact, I'm just going to collect straw on Friday to give our beds mulch, because I'm very conscious that this is the moment when the weeds just go AWOL. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's not at all. You can be mulching in different ways throughout the year, really.
Okay, thank you.
So it's called,
my bindweed is my nemesis at the allotment.
Oh yeah. I feel for you. We've got so much.
It's almost like having, ideally, it would be needing to have a whole section that you don't plant, that you just dig down so far to get it all up and clean each section to do it. But that would take so much space and time.
Yeah. The only way I think to deal with bindweed is to just constantly pulling it as much as possible. I had we had a corporate group in today, and for the first hour there was 20 of them, and I basically just said, take a wheelbarrow, go around the site, if you see any bindweed, pull it. This is bindweed, go and find some, because it does need that constant pull. Even if you can't get the roots out, just getting that growth, and eventually the root system will exhaust itself.
The biggest space for it is in my raspberries.
Yes. Yeah, there's no easy way out of that, I'm afraid.
Sally's got a question, Rosa.
Yeah, I asked this last week. Do you compost your bindweed and couch grass, or do you just put it separately and not put it on your cold compost bins?
No, we don't. The best process we've got at the minute is collecting all the bindweed and the couch grass and bagging it in empty compost bags. You're sealing it off from light, from water, and make sure you kind of roll the top down or tie it up, and then in about 3 to 4 weeks all that root has died off, and you'll notice, when a bindweed root is still alive, you can kind of snap it and it's white on the inside, whereas when it's been in a bag for 4 weeks, it's just completely rotten. You'll know it's totally like gone flat and black and rotting. And then at that point you can add it to your compost, but we add it to our dead hedge along this Frenchay Park Road. But yeah, that's the best way that I've found of dealing with the quantity that we have here. And And also important to remember that a lot of these perennial, a lot of like bindweed and couch grass love being in full sun. So if you've got a large amount of bindweed, if you can try and get it under a tree somewhere or into like a very shaded spot, it's much less likely to have the energy to take root and really kick off again. But yeah, I'd say if you've got a corner that you can start to like bag your bindweed and leave it, then that would be my advice.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes. Come back. What do you think, Steph?
Yeah.
23
Yeah.
or
20,
25? Yeah.
23, yeah.
Okay.
So if you need the toilet or a cup of tea, go now. I've been asked to get some feedback from everyone, so I'm going to launch a little poll now. And if you could answer these questions either during when you get back, or if you're not going away, do it now. That would be amazing. Can you see it? I've launched it.
Yes.
Steph,
Yes.
have you put people into groups before? Into like
Yeah.
breakout rooms?
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether we do that. Yeah, whether we try and do that after the break.
Okay. Yeah, that's dead easy.
Okay, great.
How's it going up there?
Okay. Got some more species that they you don't?
No, 5 minute break.
Rosa, there's a question in the chat from Rob about, he'd be interested to know how much prep the soil would need. Can you see that?
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through everybody's things now.
I don't know if it's there or not.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about Yeah, I'll definitely answer that at the end afterwards, sorry.
I guess you've answered the deep-rooted. Oh, maybe you didn't see that one because Sally just sent it to me, but she was wondering how to manage deep-rooted endemic couchgrass and bindweed without deep digging on my allotment. But I guess that's the exception to the no dig rule, isn't it? Bindweed.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 23 past, so is everyone back? I'm going to assume you are. Thank you for doing the poll. I'll end it now. Thank you.
So just to answer some of the questions, Rob, you said our current front garden is full of stones and a mesh to prevent weeds. Would be interested how much we need to prep the soil below for food and wildflower growing. So it's important to say that to grow wildflowers really thrive in nutrient poor soil. So a lot of our wildflower meadow and wildflower bank management is about cutting it in September. We cut and clear essentially. So cut all of the kind of like the growth and the dead heads from that summer and make sure that we're taking that organic matter away. We're not just leaving it lying on the top so that it doesn't get re-encompassed into the soil, because grasses thrive on nutrient high fertile soil. So to enable the wildflowers to outcompete the grasses, you need to be taking nutrients away. So the wildflowers need a kind of area of their own, and then you've got your food growing areas, which could be as kind of raised beds, could be through your mesh, through your weed mesh. Yeah, not sure what Rob's plan is, but it sounds like if it's very stony, that maybe some raised beds would be a good starting point.
Sean will probably be able to give you some advice next week on wildflowers that like stony ground and things like that. So maybe we can ask him.
Yeah, defo. And then another question, do you use permaculture methods at Grow Wilder? What are your thoughts on permaculture? What are the downfalls? So permaculture, my understanding of it is that it's a kind of philosophy to growing, and also to kind of philosophy to growing and to living. So they've got their three key values: fair share, which is about like sharing resources, earth care, and people care, I think, from memory. So if you think about those three different aspects, that actually those philosophies can be applied to lots of different projects and lots of different organizations, right? It doesn't have to just be growing veg. And in many ways we do use a lot of permaculture kind of methods and approaches at Grow Wilder, because we're all about prioritizing the sort of earth care, looking after wildlife. We're prioritizing the people care in terms of our kind of volunteer management and community engagement, and then the fair share side of kind of sharing resources and sharing our knowledge and all that sort of thing. So okay, I think what I might just do is finish off this little presentation, and then I'm going to give you a chance. Steph is going to put you into little breakout rooms, so that you have a chance to perhaps talk through some of these questions with each other and see if we can kind of peer support through them. So Okay, crop rotation is something really important to talk about in terms of growing veg, particularly at allotment scale. If you're thinking in kind of pots in a back garden, it's not so important, but you want to try and avoid growing the same family of plants, the same vegetable family in the same spot year on year. So particularly things like your onion family at the bottom here, which is the allium family, that is really susceptible to white rot, which kind of when you have it, you'll know you've got it, because it kind of, you will pull your onion up and the whole onion is really squidgy and it's covered in like white rotty mold. Really not very nice. As soon as you've got that, you need to make sure that you don't put any onion or allium family crops in that patch of soil for another like 4 or 5 years. It takes a really, really long time for white rot particularly to exhaust out of your soil, and white rot doesn't generally enjoy living on any of like other of your food growing plants. So so this is why we do crop rotation, is to make sure that your soil isn't getting exhausted of a particular range of nutrients, because all these different families draw different kinds of minerals and nutrients out of the soil, and to make sure, yeah, that the soil can kind of can take a breather, because there are certain kinds of plants that are more demanding of the soil than others. So the bean family, the legume family, for example, is actually a real giver. It fixes nitrogen, it fixes atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through this relationship with these nodules on its roots and the bacteria that lives within those. So they draw the atmospheric nitrogen and lock it into soil. So actually, after the bean family, it's really, really beneficial to then grow your brassica family, your cabbages, your kale, because they're incredibly nitrogen demanding, nitrogen thirsty. This little graphic here is one of the simplest crop rotations that you can run by. So year one, you've got your relatively heavy feeders, so outdoor tomatoes or potatoes, squash, things that have got like big fruiting plants. And year two, the onion family, your roots, so things like carrots and parsnips and things. And then by year three, your soil at this point is it's had a year of like heavy feeders, things like tomatoes, and then it's had a year of carrots or onions, and then comes the bean year where it kind of slightly replenishes the soil of nitrogen, and then the cabbage year. So this is just a very simple crop rotation that I wouldn't get too hung up on this. Like, it's a kind of guide, right? I mean, at Grow Wilder, I can absolutely say we don't follow this. Like, the one thing I try and do is that relationship between the beans and the cabbages. So I really try and make sure that the bed that we've planted our beans in, the kales and the broccolis go there the year after. And then, like I say, if we find anything like white rot, or if there's a particular area of the garden that has, so last summer we had our area where we planted a lot of our squash and our courgettes. They got really quite affected by powdery mildew, which is a fungal disease that's airborne. So a lot of the spores spread in the air and in the soil. And the squash got really affected by powdery mildew. So we've actually left that whole area of the garden to rest this year, because it was really quite bad. So I don't want the next year of crops to get affected by powdery mildew. And there's quite a lot of crops that get affected by mildew. So it's giving that whole zone of the market garden just a bit of a breather. Have you got any questions about crop rotation? Because we're now going to do a little exercise about it, just to kind of make sure that you've got clarity on that. So Steph is going to put you into breakout groups, and I want you to just think about your growing space and the kinds of vegetables you want to grow, first of all, and in what rotation you might do that in the next 3 to 4 years. Even if it's just an area of your allotment or a part of your garden, you don't have to do a whole garden design right now, but just think about how you might put this crop rotation into practice and apply it to your growing space. So we'll do that for until 22. So you've got just under 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and just do 5 minutes of kind of feedback and how that was. Yeah, and then we'll have some time at the end to have questions as well. Is that all clear?
Welcome back, everyone.
So how was that? Is there any questions that have emerged from those discussions?
Sorry, Rosa, it's me yet again. I've got a question which we started talking about it, and I remember thinking that I wanted to ask that question, and it was about the issue of rotation. One of the people in the breakout room was talking about planting chives around the edge of a small plot, which is a lovely idea, but my understanding of things like chives is that they'll self-seed. So does it matter? Does it matter? Do you have to rotate even when things are just seeding themselves, or do you let them get on with it? Because A, they're very pretty, B, they're alliums so that they'll have that sort of deterrent effect, or hopefully, and things like herbs, I sort of think are easier if they're very easily accessible. And of course,
I think something like chives, you're harvesting the tops of them, right? I often like chives when they're in flower in my salads and for cooking. So I guess that keeps them in check with self-seeding. They're also perennial, so you don't want to be moving them. The chives are beautiful on, as a perennial herb border. So yeah, I think if you're worried about them self-seeding too much, then just harvest more of the flowers.
Right, but we don't need to move the plants year after year in order to fulfill the rotational thing.
Not things like chives, sorry, I hadn't made that clear. The sort of perennial herbs and
keep popping up.
Things like rhubarb, stuff that's productive kind of year on year and has that isn't an annual. You're not going to be wanting to move that. Things like your raspberries, you're not going to be wanting to move. No, it's mainly the annual veg that applies to this kind of crop rotation, where each year you're planting things in different areas. I think that's one of the things I haven't actually really touched on is the perennial vegetable end of it. It's something that I'm increasingly really loving, is actually the exploration of perennial veg varieties and the different options. Like just of perennial Turkish rocket in front of me, from Alan Carter's Forest Garden. Apparently someone gave this to me, and I think there is an absolute abundance of perennials that you can sow and harvest from year on year, and you're then saving from having to disturb your soil, and they can establish that really nice relationship with the soil, and you're keeping the ground covered and so on. And also it saves on work, right? You're not having to constantly having to like sow things every single time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think exploring and experimenting with different kinds of unusual perennials is definitely a recommendation of mine. Any other questions that came up from? Oh, Ed, you've got your hand up.
Hi. Yeah, I'm just very interested in this idea of turning, let's say you were to take an average roadside curb grassland. I know it's not a garden as such, and you try to impoverish the soil by cutting once a year and getting rid of. Presumably all curbside grass is taken away anyway, so are the sort of grasslands you see by the side of roads, are they not progressively being impoverished, or does the council drench them with nutrients?
Generally speaking, the council don't clear their cuttings. So the grassland, unless they have an intentional management strategy where they're cutting and clearing,
Yeah.
the mower will go over them and the cuttings will just be left on top.
So just keep recycling nutrients then. Yeah. So I mean, I know this is a length of string type of question, so I'm not expecting a definitive answer, but if you were to follow that strategy with say an average roadside curve, you left it and you harvested it after seed set, and you repeated that every year. I mean, how many years are we talking before the soil's impoverished enough to be able to start sustaining wildflowers, yarrow and knapweed and all these things?
I mean, if you were to do it in that way, probably after like 4 or 5 years, the grass is.
Is there any way of speeding up the denutrification of the soil?
Yeah, totally. So the way we do it here is, okay, this goes against a lot of what I was talking about soil health, but if you're wanting to turn a patch of your garden and your allotment into a wildflower meadow, the way in which we do that is to kind of cut about the 2 inches, maybe 3 inches of your soil and flip it over.
Yeah.
So that the grasses are inverted and that they eventually will die. And then you can sow your wildflower seed directly onto that inverted. So you've kind of made yourself a sort of ready to go seed bed without too much deep digging and too much weeding. You're just kind of inverting the top couple of inches.
So underneath I'm sorry, I'm taking up your time now, but underneath the sort of network of root systems of the grass, that'll be impoverished soil. Is that what you're saying, basically?
No, it's just that it kicks the grasses back to the point where you can sow wildflower seed in there, and you hope that they can then start out competing. But it's something that Sean will touch on next week in his wildflower session.
Well, I know I'm getting ahead of myself here.
No, that's okay. That's great. I'm just going to share my screen again and finish the final.
Thanks for that.
No worries.
Thank you.
Can you all see that? Yes. So, yeah, just wanted to talk about kind of resourcing and next steps, and signposting you on to some interesting projects. So always oversow more than you need. I was just saying this to Steph. It's really, really, really important that you calculate the amount of space you've got, say metre by metre. You're sowing lettuce in there, 10 centimetres spacing. So you've worked out how many plugs you need, but make sure you sow 10% extra for any that are going to get munched by slugs or the pigeon's going to get. And then, so for example, today we were just planting out a load of beetroot, and we've kept back quite a lot of it because I'm guesstimating that some of it's going to die, so that in the next few days we can then fill in the spaces of plants that don't survive. You've then got extra to fill your bed out again. And always allow your plants to grow to a really substantial size before planting them out. There's a little picture here of sunflowers. I often see people trying to plant things out when they're still at this kind of stage, when the seed is only about emerging and it's got the 2 seed leaves, which often are, kind of quite plain, and then or people might start planting out of this. But actually, if we're talking particularly about brassicas, so cabbages and things, because they are so susceptible to getting eaten by lots of things, I actually try and make sure that my cabbages and kale are a really substantial size in a kind of 9 centimetre pot. They've probably got 3 or 4 sets of adult leaves on them before I'll put them outside. or into the ground, so that they've just got so much more chance, basically. And I also, because we bring on a lot of plants inside our polytunnel, we've got this kind of multi-stage process of getting them into the ground. We've got to harden them off, which effectively means making them more resilient to the outside British weather. So they come from this very incubated environment. So you have to leave them outside in their trays to get used to the cold. And then you're kind of staggering those shocks. So you're bringing them outside of the outside into like cold temperature. So that's one shock. And then you're doing the planting out, the root disturbance shock at a different date. So just making sure that you've hardened them off properly, and they'll have more chance of survival. And then always when you're transplanting things, you're thinking about protecting and you're thinking about support. So don't just plant your cabbages out and think, okay, tomorrow I'll put a net over them, because by the time you're there tomorrow, they'll all be gone. So make sure that you've prepared before you've got your plants in your hand and you're about to put them in the hole in the soil, that you've got your net or you've got your bean poles with you. So you've got all of that in order. You might think, but the beans are so small, they're not going to need support for weeks. But life gets busy, and then the beans are all flopping all over the place. So make sure you just kind of, you're thinking about that protection, support, and irrigation when you're planting out. And then finding your nearest plant swap and seed swap is also mega. I'm sure some of you have been to Bristol Seed Swap, a really amazing, very busy event most Februaries down at the Trinity Centre, and they have an absolute abundance of seed. So yeah, really worth going to that. I am particularly passionate about seed saving. I think it's a really, really important kind of next step, I guess, when you get to the point where you feel quite comfortable in your growing, or just intrigued about plants in a different way. It definitely develops that kind of intimate relationship with them a lot further, particularly with veg plants, because a lot of them are annuals, or a lot of them, like things like beetroot, okay, you actually harvest them before you see them go to seed. So if you're collecting beetroot seed, you are kind of stewarding them through to the point where they start to flower and seed, and you see how a beetroot plant or a kale plant gets absolutely enormous. This picture on the bottom left is a brassica seed pod, which I thought was always quite interesting. So yeah, Vital Seeds and Real Seeds are really lovely seed companies that grow kind of organic, ecologically sound seed, and would really highly recommend that intro to seed saving course online. I think it's about 40 quid with Vital Seeds, and it really just, for those that are or get really into veg growing, I think that's a really amazing kind of foundation of seed saving. And then for me, just the kind of other sources recommendation. This is kind of bigger picture food growing, but I've got a big interest in the kind of politics of it. So I always encourage people to, if they want to dive into that. Think about where our food is coming from. Think about who can access it. And yeah, some of these organisations are doing really, really important kind of food sovereignty, food justice work. So that's the end of my little presentation. We've got 5 minutes left. And yeah, I hope that's been interesting, helpful, useful. And I guess keep in touch with Steph with any photos and what you all go on to grow this summer. But good luck. And yeah, if you've got any final questions, do fire away.
There's a few
Very
questions in the chat.
Very
Rosa.
helpful. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Ed.
We'll see you next week.
Could you tell more about bug lines? Okay, yeah. That was just I think it was a neighbourly grant for like 100 quid. I mean, it was absolutely nothing, but one of my neighbours went for it, and she was asking for this bee line, and yeah, so it's just on our street to get flowers in everybody's front garden, and to kind of share resources. So yeah, there are little pots of money out there if you wanted to go for things like that.
Rosa, I'm just wondering whether you feed, if you're keeping your plants indoors until they're relatively big plants, do you continue to feed? Did you feed them in any way? Surely.
Oh, great question, Jan. I was going to say we make comfrey feed.
Yeah, we do that. Yeah.
Yeah, so which is a kind of biofertilizer. Some, for those that haven't heard of it, it's essentially comfrey is a really amazing plant. It has an incredibly deep taproot and draws up all of these nutrients from kind of subsoil or deep soil, and hold it in their leaves, and then you harvest the leaves, put them in a pillowcase or some sort of container, soak them in water, and the water you can then water your plants with, water the plants in, is one way of doing it actually. But the other way of doing it is to allow the leaves to kind of self-juice. So you just put them all dry in a big tub, and they kind of as they start to decompose, they kind of juice out all of their goodness, and then you can dilute that down and water your plants. So particularly for plants that are in pots for a long time, that's really good to do after a few weeks.
And when you've made your comfrey tea, do you have any way of checking its strength? Because, for example, if you use Tomorite or one of the manufactured, we make our own comfrey tea, but one thing that I'm not sure about is how I can, for small plants in pots, how I can be sure that I'm not overfeeding or underfeeding. So I generally only use the comfrey tea as a dilute onto flower beds and outside. So I just wondered if you got any advice on that one?
Yeah, the way we make it is the second method I was talking about. So we actually don't I don't know why we do this, because with our nettle tea and with our horsetail tea, we chuck it all in water, so we don't actually know the dilute ratio. But with our comfrey tea, we just allow it to kind of self-juice, and we weigh it down with bricks, and then it all comes out the bottom out of a tap into a bucket. So we know generally it is quite a consistent concentration, and then we just put a capful in a 10-litre watering can and fill that with water. So it is quite diluted, and I think it's important to have it more diluted than strong, because you don't want to overdo it, So I think if you err on the side of more dilute, if you're
okay. And how often would you feed those pots?
So the way we do it is that we water them with comfrey tea when we plant them out.
Okay, so stay in the pots until they're quite well grown, just with the nutrients that's in the soil at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say, like, now we've planted our tomatoes out in the tunnel already, but we've got a lot of excess tomatoes that we're now just selling on site, and they are really in need of a feed. You can tell because the leaves are starting to go kind of yellow. So they would really benefit from a comfrey feed. So thanks for the reminder. I'll do that. Any more questions?
I was just wondering about I wonder sometimes if I kind of overflog my soil, because I might kind of take the potatoes out and then put in kale or something for the winter, and then take that out and in the spring and put something else in. So you almost sort of something's 2 crops a year. So how much extra do you have to do in the way of composting and things if you want to keep something like that going?
I think in a way you just have to trust your instinct, in a way that if you've given your soil if you've put layers of compost and you've perhaps used comfrey tea or something, I think you would know if the soil was starting to feel, you know, your plants would start to suffer if the nutrients were really off. But it's very, it's very rare really on a kind of allotment scale growing for that to happen. It's more kind of big field scale growing we're talking, you know. I think the fact a lot of allotmenting bring, you know, kind of pros and cons to this, but we bring in a lot of material in wood chip and in compost form, so it's very rare for soils to be kind of truly depleted. Yeah.
Which also we've been wondering whether it is actually that relevant to be so on with crop rotation, because we're continually feeding and putting nutrients back into the soil.
Yeah.
What do you think about that in your
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm not very strict with crop rotation. The only relationship I try and bear in mind is that bean and brassica one, because I know it just works. You know, I know that the beans lock nitrogen and the brassicas need nitrogen. So
Yeah.
that's the only one I really try and plan for when I'm planning my growing in sort of January, February, to make sure that each year that they're kind of following each other. And then of course, like keeping in mind if any diseases or kind of, yeah, like the mildew or the white rot, if anything is coming up like that, then it's important to react. But yeah, I won't people get quite twisted into that, thinking, oh no, but I haven't put this and I don't know where to put that, and it's not necessary, you know, just do what you can.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's basically 8 o'clock. So as long as
Yeah.
you're all happy, we can.
Thank you for your time. It's been
Thank
really
you
good.
very much,
Thank you.
Rosa.
Thanks for coming, everyone. See you
Thank you
next
very much. Bye.
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 Yes, thanks both. It's been really, really good.
Good.
Thanks for coming.